For a church like ours, 150 years is impressive. 150 years is really significant. You know, it's that much more impressive and that much more significant that after 150 years, we are still going strong. It's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing. And this week, as I was preparing the message for this morning, thinking about what I wanted to talk about, the primary thing that I did was I looked through the histories of our congregation. The history written by Neil and the history that we used for the 125th anniversary celebration 25 years ago. And as I was looking through this history of our specific church, of our specific congregations, here's what I noticed. I noticed first, because I am one, and obviously I looked to this first. I noticed the different pastors that have served this congregation throughout the years. And I, of course, make note of how long they stayed. Some of them only stayed for a year or two, and others stayed for close to 20, investing the most fruitful years of their ministry here in our congregation. Also, as you read through the history, you find references to significant leaders that we have had in our church, lay leaders, different people who took on a position or a role and served faithfully and diligently for many, many years, and then at some point were recognized for their efforts. There's references to different councils, different elder bodies, different deacon bodies. There's, of course, a record of other steps that our church, our congregation has taken in its history. Expansion projects, building projects, moving projects. We weren't always in this location. You read the history of our congregation, and you also see the evolution, I guess I'll say, of what a worship service looked like. It was kind of interesting. At our last 150th committee meeting, one of the members brought up the fact that before we had an organ in church, there was actually a group of people who would come up to the front and they would lead the congregation in singing at the beginning of the service. And we chuckled about that a little bit because we thought, well, maybe contemporary worship isn't quite as contemporary as we thought, right? But it's not just that. I mean, there are even more significant transitions than that. I mean, think about the transition from services in Dutch to services in English. And how did they navigate that? You know, the history kind of glosses over the reality that there were people who probably felt extremely strongly on both sides of that issue. People that were firm in maintaining the heritage that they brought over from the old country, and then others who wanted to be more relevant and you know, we need to start doing services in English because our children are not keeping up with the Dutch language. As you look at the history of our church, you see the inception and the development of different ministry programs, Sunday school, the different societies, the different groups. And boy, that's exciting stuff. That's exciting stuff, and you just get a sense that even written in the council minutes from years and years ago, there was an excitement about these new opportunities and these new ministries, these new ways, opportunities for fellowship. You read the history of our church, and you'll also see that there were people, big groups of people, big consensuses of people in our church that were instrumental in founding and establishing the Christian schools in our area. And then, of course, in our records, in our history, in the council minutes from years and years past, there's references to different missionaries, different missions, different ministries outside of our congregation that, early on we supported with pennies and dollars, and as time progressed, we have supported with thousands upon thousands of dollars. So looking at our church's history from our present vantage point, where we sit this morning, where we sit in a place of stability, where we sit in a place of strength, a place of optimism. For me, I know, I hope for you. It's the easiest thing to look at our history from a humanist perspective. What do I mean by that? We can celebrate the strong leaders from the past on whose shoulders we stand today. We can celebrate the brilliant strategic planning that has made our church sustainable for so long. We celebrate the decisions we've made that historically have proven to be the right decisions. We celebrate who we have been, and we celebrate who we are. In other words, we can approach our 150th anniversary by celebrating our faithfulness to God. Isn't it obvious? I mean, we're a success. We're a success. Look at all these people. 3 cheers for us. We've done a great job. Well, if that's our point of view, if that's the posture we take, then Psalm 78, which we just read, is probably going to fall on deaf ears. Because look, if that's going to be our perspective, I want to just circle back and pose some questions to you. I want you to think about this. In every instance in our history, can we honestly say that we called, in every instance, the best pastor for the job? Or did we always follow the best leaders at just the right time in our history? We just had a sense of who to follow, and we were true to it. When we undertook projects and plans, were they perfectly planned? Were they perfectly executed? Have all the decisions we have made regarding worship, for instance, have all of those decisions been made for the right reasons? Did we choose and develop ministry programs that accomplished precisely what we intended them to accomplish? Even Christian schools, when those Christian schools were established, did we do that in the best possible way that we could? Did we get the most buy-in within our greater community that we could possibly have gotten? Finally, have we, in every case, invested in ministries and missions that have borne the most fruit? Have we picked the best options? Have we been the best stewards of our money? Have we always given to the things that God has blessed the most? Brothers and sisters, I think that you will agree. that we certainly could have done things better, could have probably made better decisions. I don't know what those would be. I'm just saying that there were probably better decisions to be made. I'm just saying that in a lot of cases there were probably better options that could have been explored. See, a humanistic perspective, focusing on what we have done, leaves us with only two explanations as to where we are today. The first explanation is just that we are really, really smart. And we are really, really righteous. We are right in tune with God. We are really, really good. But that's pretty arrogant to say, isn't it? I mean, that's pretty arrogant to say that our success can be attributed to our own goodness and our own intelligence and our own brilliance and our own knack for picking and embarking on just the right strategy. That's the position we take when we're wanting to take all of the credit for our success. And yeah, God is there, but it's because we made good decisions that God is on our side. So that's the first explanation we could have for what we enjoy today. The second, from a humanistic perspective anyway, would be this. Two, it's very simply, we're just really lucky. Okay? Yeah, maybe we haven't always thought out our decisions well. Maybe we haven't always made the best decisions, but for some reason, things have just worked out really, really well. We've been extremely, extremely lucky. But now let's play out both of those explanations into the future. If, from a humanistic perspective, we take one or the other of those explanations for what we enjoy today and we project those into the future, here's what we have. If we're really just that smart, and if we're really just that brilliant with regards to strategy, then the first explanation puts all of the pressure on us, all of the pressure on our shoulders to continue making the right decisions in every single case. Whether it regards worship, whether it regards building and renovation, whether it's regarding the ministries that we support and to what extent, we have got to be perfect. We have got to make the right decisions, or this all comes crashing down. Now, if that's the position we take, then making any decision would be absolutely paralyzing, wouldn't it? Knowing that everything could rest on that right decision. The second explanation, just kind of figuring that we're where we're at because of dumb luck, is really not better, not much better. That puts no pressure on us whatsoever to make the right decisions, to seek God's will for our lives. That explanation just puts us in a position to hope that our luck holds out. And so that's not so paralyzing. That's just careless. Let me state the obvious. God does not want us to be paralyzed when it comes to making decisions and moving boldly into the future, and neither does he want us to be careless in that. So there's got to be another alternative. There's got to be another way to approach a celebration like this, 150 years and still going strong. And I believe that Psalm 78 paints that alternative picture for us. See, Psalm 78, the first verses that we read, and continuing on in the psalm, puts God at the very center of everything that happens. He is the starting point. He is the ending point. He is the central point. everything is God. Everything is God's sovereignty. Everything is a result of God's love. Psalm 78 says God's praiseworthy deeds. It says God's power. It says the wonders that he has done. The message in these first verses of Psalm 78 is that God is faithful to all generations. And so as we look at our history, whether it's our entire history going all the way back through the scriptural witness, or whether it's our entire history going back to the beginning of the church, or whether it's our history looking back into the life of simply this church, it is God's faithfulness that is the active agent at every point. God is faithful to all generations. He has always been, he is right now, and he will be in the future. Now, those first two alternatives, those first two explanations, those humanist explanations, are completely obliterated if you read forward in Psalm 78. Actually, as inspiring as those first verses are, it's not a terribly happy psalm. It's not a very happy psalm at all. You know, for all of this talk about God's wondrous deeds and God's works and God's power, that verse 8 is kind of a transition verse, and that's why I included it. That's a little bit more ominous, where it says they would not be like their forefathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, whose hearts were not loyal to God, whose spirits were not faithful to him. Psalm 78 goes on for 55 verses. 55 verses of talking about Israel's history and how, despite God's faithfulness over and over and over again, Israel continued to turn away from God, continued to do their own thing, continued to make bad decisions. Now, I'm not saying that characterizes our history, but it gives us the proper window of looking at our history and God's place in it. It is God's faithfulness that sustains us. If left to ourselves, if resting on the merit of our own decisions and our own courses of action, we would destroy ourselves virtually immediately. Psalm 78 reveals that God is faithful despite our unfaithfulness. And it's not 150 years of unfaithfulness. But there is unfaithfulness that is woven through there, because there is unfaithfulness woven through every human's life and every family's life and every church's life. It challenges us to view our history not with arrogance, but with humility. See, if not for God, we would never have experienced any measure of success. What Psalm 78 tells us is that God's faithfulness is the reality of the day. And another thing that it tells us, it implies that God's faithfulness is not conditional, okay? God remained faithful to his people even when they turned away from him. God's faithfulness is always there. The question is whether we are recognizing it, whether we are receiving it, whether we are hearing it, and whether we are speaking it. But whether we are or not, God's faithfulness is present and God's faithfulness is active. Charles Spurgeon had this quote that I found this week. The glory of God's faithfulness is that no sin of ours has ever made him unfaithful. Here's the issue. Here's what's at issue. is that we are not going to thrive and we are not going to flourish if we don't recognize and receive God's faithfulness. But what I love about Psalm 78 is its attention not only to the past, that God is faithful through all of the good times and all of the bad times, but Psalm 78 points to the future as well. In verse 6, it paints this vision of one generation passing the faith, passing the knowledge of God to the next. And then that generation passing a knowledge of God and the faith down to the next. And that generation passing it down to the next. There is a future aspect in Psalm 78. A future aspect that should give us hope. Should give us hope. Especially if we are resting on the promises of God, especially if we are leaning into God's faithfulness and not depending on our own decisions and our own hard work. In other words, in Psalm 78, God says, my faithfulness will not change. Another interesting thing about our history and God's faithfulness, I would argue that even if we were a struggling and dying church today, that still wouldn't change the fact that God had been, has been, and is still being faithful. God's faithfulness is always present, is always constant. Edmund Clowney, who is an author that I have just been exposed to recently, had this quote. He said, "Trials should not surprise us or cause us to doubt God's faithfulness. Rather, we should actually be glad for them. God sends trials to strengthen our trust in Him so that faith will not fail. Our trials keep us trusting. They burn away our self-confidence and drive us to our Savior." And see, that is ultimately what the takeaway, I think, from Psalm 78 is. And that's the takeaway from 150 years of success in this church through good times and through bad times. See, we need to put our trust in the right place. And, it's interesting. I'm doing a Bible study right now about seeing the opportunities that God puts before us and walking through the right doors. And the thing that's becoming ever more obvious in this Bible study is that it's not so much the specific decisions that we make. It has a lot more to do with the posture with which we make them. So when it comes to decisions in the church, when it comes to leaders to appoint and to elect, when it comes to pastors to call, we're just dependent on God's grace. And as long as we make those decisions with humility, and as long as we make those decisions with a measure of confidence in God's faithfulness, God is going to honor that, and God is going to be able to work through that. What He can't work through is when we are arrogant and when we are taking the credit for what is being accomplished. The takeaway from Psalm 78 is where to put our trust every single day when we wake up. Every single day in our own lives and in the life of this church. So Psalm 78 references the past. Psalm 78 references the future. Psalm 78 probably most pointedly addresses us right now, addresses the present. It encourages us to look to the past with eyes that see God's faithfulness through it all. In so doing, we build trust in that, and therefore we look to the future with a confidence that God will continue to be faithful, and that God will continue to call a people unto himself, and that God will continue to keep us pointed in the right direction. And what we need to worry about then, because there is a way for us to respond, and our work is to some extent important, and it has to do with today. What Psalm 78 tells us to be mindful of is teaching the next generation what it means to be a Christian. In other words, it is both hearing and speaking the gospel. Not just to our own children, but to the next generation, to what is already out there in the world. It is an invitation to speak about the wondrous things that God has done, continues to do, and will continue to do. It invites us to be a part of that. That is how we participate in God's faithfulness. We respond with the best measure of our own faithfulness that we can muster. We travel forward, we make decisions, we deal with the gospel with confidence. And in so doing, we can be assured of God's smile on our lives, God's smile on this church, and God's continuing faithfulness every single day.